when I've seen that, it's less about can we actually provide all the tutorials and onboarding flows that are intuitive and like seed the product with demo data. It's less that and more of like, can this person navigate the ability to connect things or get data into the product? It could be people data like PII data, or it could be integrations. And do they have permissions to do that or not? So those are more of like what I am getting at when I say like enterprise or having like a more handheld type of motion is like there's often roadblocks to products that like a security person or a finance person or someone else might hold the keys to, but they're not the same champion of the product.
Welcome to ThriveCast. Our today's topic is the GTM journey from seed to scale. And with me, I have Kevin White. Kevin's currently the head of marketing at Common Room. He's also been a growth advisor for a few early stage startups. I recently met him at one of the meetups in Bay Area where he highlighted the current struggle between working on PLG and working on SLG back into the church and state separation. We ended up talking about it and we decided to bring together a podcast. He's also performed and scaled demand gen for single store, segment, and retool in the past decade or so. Kevin, welcome to ThriveCast. How are you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I'm excited to carry on the conversation from when we met the other day. That was a fun time. And happy to join and hopefully I can help out. I know it's a hot topic, so I'm happy to get into it.
Yeah. So Kevin, for the listeners, maybe if you could introduce a little bit about how you got into growth and demand gen and maybe a little bit about what Common Room is and then take it from there.
Yeah, sure. We can do that. I think origin stories are always interesting. I certainly didn't set out to have this to fall into what I'm working on right now as part of my career when I was young and in college. But I guess a good place to start is the first company I joined, which is a company called Giga, which got acquired by SAP, but that was a long time ago. And essentially they brought me on and they were like, hey, we bought this thing called Marketo. This is back in, I think, 2010. They're like, can you figure out how it works? You have some experience with tech, figure it out. And so that kind of got me into the world of marketing op and demand gen and SaaS, which was just really great learning experience. And then from there, just parlayed that into doing similar stuff at single store and then getting into more of a PLG motion. I think Segment is a prime example of that, and leading the growth team there. I just learned a ton. We did a lot, and hopefully I can share some of the gotchas with everyone here so that you don't have to go through the same pain that I went through at Segments. And then also we did similar go-to-market motion at Retool, and then now I'm at Common Room. Just real quick with Common Room, we are a platform that pulls in signals, product signals, social signals, community signals all into one place so that community, DevRel, sales, and go-to-market teams can take action on those signals. So it's a nice way of pulling together hard to find data points all into one place and then being able to operationalize that at the same time. We'll get into more of that, I'm sure, at some point, but let's get into the questions here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Common Room is also at a good place in time with all of the market automations and product usage and all of that signals coming in. So that's wonderful. So Kevin, to our today's conversation, could you maybe tell a little bit about the GTM journey that a seed stage company starts off with? Maybe let's paint the picture that, hey, there are these seed companies who may not have yet achieved a product market fit. They might be either pre-revenue or they have achieved some kind of a revenue, but not repeatable enough to say that they are in a PMF stage. But could you throw some light on what could be the potential acquisition strategies? I know you've done some of that as part of your previous career. You've also been advising various early stage companies. So maybe let's touch upon the acquisition strategies. And then we'll take the same startup and let it grow a little bit. So we'll tell the story from that side.
Yeah, sounds good. So I feel things start out on the seed. They start with you don't have a product, and then you do have a product, and then you need to get word out about that product. And so a lot of it actually starts with the hands-on person-to-person approach, but it's more like founder-led sales. Like a founder has to get the word out. They have to reach out to people who they think would be a good fit for their products. Oftentimes they're solving their own problem and can find people in their network that are like them. So just getting something off the ground is actually the do things that don't scale kind of method of reaching out to people with cold outbound, getting them to use the product. Actually, David, who's the CEO at Retool, there's some stories out there about how that's how he started out and how Retool started to find product market fit. But once you get past that stage, or maybe if you have a big splash on Hacker News or Product Hunt or something like that, and you get enough traction and people using the product, then there's different acquisition strategies, especially with a small team. And those typically fall into the buckets of, especially for DevTool, something like open source. Open source is a great way to get distribution and get people using products. And then for the non-open source, we see a lot of people going the product-led side of product-led route. That can be broken up into like freemium, like free trial to paid, or I don't know if there's too many other varieties, but so there's different approaches there, and that all just depends on your product. I would first start with what does your product do, who's the right audience for that, and like where can you distribute your product to the right audience, and that kind of will dictate your go-to-market motion and maybe even how you set up the model for how you're going to acquire new users. I guess I'll pause there, and then we can, if there's more detail, we can address that too that you need.
Yeah, super. I think that's a good segue into this debate that is constantly going on between open source and freemium models and hosted SaaS models with freemium. What do you think at the stage when the companies are, especially during either seed or PMF stages, I'm guessing that they may not have enough opportunities to figure out what their GTM motions should be, whether it's PLG or SLG. Have you seen any companies there at that stage which make a decision that they want to go PLG or they want to go SLG or they want to go open source, and building that conviction very early on might be slightly difficult? So what do you see out there?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the complexity of the product and the target audience. The last question, I didn't fully elaborate too much on that, so this is a good segue into that. Depending on the complexity of the product would dictate to me of should this be a full-on hands-on free trial and need to get a CSM involved and do some sort of concierge program versus something that's more, I'm a core user, I've used products like this in the past, I can grok this without too much hand-holding, and that maybe lends itself to more of a PLG transactional kind of motion. And then on the dev side, if you give someone an open source version of the product, do you have the right kind of support structure for developers to get a hold of your product and figure it out, and then also ask questions? A lot of times the founders and early team will help with the community building side of things and supporting that motion. I think for more concrete examples in maybe companies to look at as examples, if I was starting out with something like a Calendly or a Figma, I feel like those are products that are, once you get into the product, you can really understand how it works without a lot of hand-holding. And those kinds of products kind of lend themselves more to this PLG. I'm going to sign up for the product. I'm going to do a POC, see that it works, get value out of it, and then maybe pay with a credit card. And that's my only interaction with sales, which is no sales at all. It's just purely working with software or using it, go through a user experience. And then maybe on the more hand-holding side of things, if you're competing with a CRM or a type of product that has lots of integrations or something that's when you need to say, okay, use PLG or use Freemium as a way to get people to sign up. There's no barriers to entry, but that's when you're going to have some sort of actual people looking at who's signing up, seeing if they are a fit for the ideal customer profile, and then trying to offer some guidance to them so that they can be successful with the product. Because if you just drop them in, they're not going to be successful unless you have some sort of more of a human touch. Some products you can get around that, or some people are more savvy than others, but that's just a good rule of thumb for complexity of your product dictates how you get people to sign up and how you acquire people for the product, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I was actually talking to a few SaaS builders almost about 2 weeks back or so, and we got into a debate between PLG versus SLG and complex product, as you mentioned, versus something that you can simplify with onboarding. Maybe a question to you. Assume that the product might be slightly complex, so there's always room to improve your onboarding experiences. Have you seen companies at seed stages or PMF stages primarily where they spend a whole bunch of time on improving their, should you say, setup or activation module wherein users are signing up regardless of how these users have been acquired, either through PLG motions or SLG, allowing the product itself to guide them to activate? Have you seen that kind of investments happen that early in the stages?
Yeah, I have. I think it's less, when I've seen that, it's less about can we actually provide all the tutorials and onboarding flows that are intuitive and seed the product with demo data. It's less that and more of can this person navigate the ability to connect things or get data into the product? It could be people data like PII data, or it could be integrations. And do they have permissions to do that or not? Those are more of what I'm getting at when I say enterprise or having a more handheld type of motion. Is there's often roadblocks to products that a security person or a finance person or someone else might hold the keys to, but they're not the same champion of the product. So they're not the end user. So that's oftentimes when it makes sense to go more of the PLS, like freemium sign up to sales motion versus just getting immediate value out of the product as an end user, and then even having a credit card to pay for a more robust version of that product. So I look at it a little bit more from that lens versus can we really optimize the heck out of our onboarding flow to make things better. There's certainly arguments and experiments to be had on both sides, but I think a very clear line in the sand is what access can people on the user end have to get data into the product to make it usable. And if that is a blocker, then I would certainly go like the route of PLS.
Got it. So it's not so much as whether the product is complex or not, whether I think what you're saying is if the access or permission required to adopt that product is going to be beyond the influence of that particular user who's signing up. In that case, you might definitely need a human touch. It looks like that's what you're saying, right? So if there's a permission issue, then in that case, that product cannot be adopted directly by the end user. It might need a manager or somebody else, could be an IT operations or DevOps, or maybe, let's say in case of cloud security products, could be access control to their AWS account or Azure account or something of that sort. So is permission a good indicator of if we enable that, make it extremely open, help them understand that's what they have to do? Then bringing in either a CSM or a PLS or some kind of a sales assist to do white glove onboarding, that can probably solve that issue, right? So have you seen startups struggle towards, maybe there are three things, right? The one is the end user motivated to sign up to your product, which is mostly about the value proposition and all of that. I think you mentioned about that. The second part is, are they able to understand what they will achieve if they continue the sign up and all the way to activation? And the third part you mentioned about the permission, right? So is permission a blocker in general?
Yeah, I don't think it needs to be that perspective. It's more of just like an example of complexity or hurdles to get into a product. I certainly think that like last part of it is critical to understand is what is the buying committee? If the buying committee is not the end user or the end user doesn't have the power to purchase something like, or to get the right kind of data or features or benefits out of the software, then you have to go a separate route or just get a separate vector than product led, because they're going to need to pull in more people to make a decision to use the product. And that's where you have that like hands-on touch of showing someone a demo, painting the vision of this is where you can get to, and then getting that kind of buy-in on the security, procurement, et cetera side of things to be like, oh, this is a solution that our team is going to have. We're going to have a strong payoff if we use this product. It's going to add a lot of value. In the ideal world, we can do everything with software and we don't need any like hands-on sales or CSM resources, but oftentimes that's not the case for these more like complex products. Not complex in terms of ability, but maybe more complex in just like how you get data in, how you get permissions to use it. If there's PII data, there's certainly a lot of hurdles around that. So typically I found that's a proxy for if you should have more of a freemium to product-led sales motion versus a freemium to product-led transactional to like upsell and expansion type of motion after someone's already using and paying for your product.
Got it. Okay, so maybe at this stage, let's maybe expand our story. Let's assume that this particular startup that we were talking about, they started achieving a lot of signups. They started activating customers regardless of how the customers came in. And they have now achieved some kind of a PMF. Could you paint the picture of what's the right time that you have seen when, especially in this day and age where sales and marketing dollars are coming at a premium, is about hiring the first salesperson? Have you seen that companies start focusing on DLG to PLS and sales as often, or do they wait on until they get to some kind of a revenue milestone to hire their first salesperson? And maybe let's build the story upon that. And I have a lot of questions to you about you. You've experienced this many times before. Hiring the first salesperson comes with its own overhead. I will touch upon that very soon. But maybe let's start about when do they hire? When do they hire the first salesperson?
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. And as a proxy, I feel around anywhere between like even 500,000 to 5 million in revenue, call it, like typically when you start to see at least one sales hire or two sales hire come on. But I feel like the revenue number is a bit misleading as like a benchmark for when to hire someone on the go-to-market sales side of things. Instead, there's some things where you have a really good problem where it's, okay, you have people who are using the self-serve version of your product and they're like, okay, we need to expand, we need to have compliance, we need to pull in procurement and all this kind of stuff. And that's a really good problem where if you don't have any salespeople, then it's the founder doing that and they're essentially being pulled in. And that's a really good sign that, okay, we're getting demand from the self-service users that we've signed up and who are using the product, and we need to bake in some sales assisted motions so that we could accommodate the needs of these earlier stage like PLG customers. So that's one sign. I feel if you're fortunate to have enough to have that, then that's a clear signal that you need to hire some go-to-market people. The other side of things would be more like we're not hitting our revenue targets. Maybe our product is more complex than we actually realize, and maybe it makes sense to hire a sales headcount or to see if that more hands-on motion will yield better results. But I would say to get back to who to hire, how to make the right kind of hires, kind of thing. What I've seen work really well, especially at the early stage, is to hire either out of your users, like hire someone who's a power user who's maybe looking for a job, or there's probably some graceful ways to poach your actual users. Sure. I wouldn't do that at the risk of upsetting the people or the founders that the people work for. But that's often a good pool of people who would make for good early first hires. The other would just be more of like almost like a hybrid sales engineer / go-to-market person type of role, because at this early stage, you're going to need to have someone who can do the job of technical selling, like understanding empathy for the end user, being able to jump into the product and really know how to use the product. And so in the ideal scenario, I would hire 2 people who are like fit that profile, who can work and bounce ideas off of each other, and they can friendly compete with each other to start to scale revenue until they have some sort of like repeatable motion. And then at that point would hire in someone to manage and scale the team, because it's, we've already figured out like the patterns and the details from these 2 people who are like very hands-on figuring out all this stuff, because there's a lot of learning to happen in the beginning of bringing on a sales team. That would be like the perfect scenario. There's other scenarios we can talk about, but I think if I were to start from scratch, like that would be what I'd want to look for, and what I'd look for in terms of joining a new team is if they've figured out this motion and that now it's time to just make it repeatable and scalable.
Yeah, maybe I think this is a good segue into, let's assume for a moment that we've had 1 or 2 sales reps, could be 1 sales engineer or an AE, and then you have the whole DLG self-service team, which is focusing on the acquisition and activation, all of that. This is the time when there's conflicts that begin, right? Who owns what, right? Is sales only closing deals that are coming in from self-serve, or are they going out and doing some outbound as well? What have you seen? Maybe let's talk about what potential points of conflicts happen at these stages. When you hire the first sales guys, their quotas, their all of that now is completely different. It's not completely sales-led. It's both product and sales-led at that time. So could you maybe expand a little bit of what you have seen out there on what are the primary sources of conflicts at this stage?
Yeah, I can certainly share a lot from my experience, especially around what not to do, and that is have a complete free-for-all of the sales team to go after the customer base that's all been self-serve to date. I would definitely not recommend that. That's actually something that happened to us at Segment, where it made our revenue numbers look really good when we started to scale out our sales team, but it was at the detriment of depleting more of our self-service customers than we could replenish quickly. And so our S-curve looked really good, and then all of a sudden it flattened out, and then I was stuck with panic for a few quarters until we could resolve things. But we were very early in product-led sales there, and we learned the hard way, and hopefully what we can share here and going forward, there's better ways. So we did, when I moved to Retool, I had this in mind and worked with our head of revenue there to resolve and draw lines in the sand and have this kind of church and state separation. I think for like some heuristics for what lines in the sand to draw actually come back to the somewhat of the procurement security side of things, or the usage side of things, where you set some sort of like rules of engagement with the sales team, which is if someone's coming up towards like usage ceilings, you can only engage with them after they're at beyond 90% of like where their capacity is going to take them. And then that's the point when you want to like start the sales conversation, or you can initiate a conversation when they request for some sort of like privacy requirements or connect some sort of integration. So I think it's like figuring out like where your product adds that enterprise value or that like sales value for an annual contract, and then like setting like either a bar that's slightly below that and someone's coming up upon that ceiling or threshold, or they're doing activities that are like hand raising that are hitting limitations where they need to raise their hand and say, I need something more. And that's when the sales team can come in and engage. I think that's a good starting point. Over time, you typically see certain profiles and personas come in where it's, okay, this person signed up, like they really fit our enterprise account criteria. They're probably going to run a POC, and let's just start early on with the sales conversation. But like when you're first making that transition, I think it's really critical to set those lines in the sand, and they typically come with some sort of like security, usage, seat consumption, that kind of thing, to where you can have this agreement of the handoff between like where the self-serve team is in agreement that, okay, now it's time to bring in a salesperson. Yeah, there's a lot of nuance to that, but generally I think that's a good heuristic.
Yeah, so I've just noted down security, privacy, compliance could be one bucket. Essentially anything that is going to procurement. Maybe at that time, how big the customer is or the firmography of the customer might be also important. Usage ceiling, you mentioned about it. You talked about hand raising of I need some help here and so on and so forth. All this is good. I think maybe there's a criteria for that. And that's the playbook that needs to be written. What have you seen that can go into an organizational conflict of who owns this customer, who owns the compensation associated to the deal? Typically, even before the sales guys are coming in, if it might be a CSM or someone who's doing the onboarding, the leadership team would have said, hey, if you're activating that customer and they go into a self-serve revenue, this is your compensation. So there might be some conversations about if you do this, you have a compensation there. But now you have a sales hire and they are now trying to upsell, if you will, right? Upsell or maybe a cross-sell. So at that time, who should be compensated? So any deals that the sales team touches and they're able to convert, would you suggest that's who the compensation should be attached to? Versus anything which is self-serve revenue goes to somebody else?
Yeah, the nice thing about self-serve revenue is that in theory, it's self-serve. It doesn't require a human touch, and therefore there's incentive structures that you can put in place, but it's less of I made this sale, like I get this commission kind of thing on the go-to-market side of things. So typically, like I haven't seen growth teams who own the self-service number really even be compensated. It might be a good idea to compensate them or have some sort of incentive of if you get this much self-serve revenue, then you'll be bonused off of that. But typically, like it's a product, like the growth team is like a product person, a design person, and maybe like a marketing person as like a small team, maybe like data analytics as well, or like some overlap between all those 4 different roles. But that team does feel like altruistic about, I want to have the best, customer experience possible, because the better customer experience means like the more sales, more revenue. And everyone has goals and motivations around driving the number and hitting their number, regardless of whether there's extra compensation involved with that or not. I think like where I've seen conflict there, and this was from me being at Segment on the self-service team, is that we'd have these larger self-service customers who, it was really like an 80-20 rule, like where 20 of them made up like a large portion of the revenue. Yeah. And of course, like those were the ones that our sales team would take and turn that $6,000 annual contract into $60,000, which is great for the company overall, but it's really demotivating on the growth side of things because you're just hitting ceilings of like how much you can grow, because essentially the sales team is taking that deal and like turning it into enterprise revenue, which is better for the whole company. So I think if I were to go back and change that, it would be rewarding that self-service team for and giving them that either bonus or incentive for this kind of positive expansion, but like it looks bad for your metrics because self-service metrics are hurt a lot when there's churn, but the churn is good churn because the churn is going to the sales team. I think that's like the stuff you have to think through of what's going to be, actually I would just tie everything as much as possible back to the customer experience. But the reason for sales teams is because like they need a better customer experience. They need more hand-holding, they need more permissioning, they need annual contracts from the discount and all that kind of stuff. So I think working out those details is really just a great, again, going back to agreement between the growth team and sales team alignment and just incentivizing the right kind of behaviors. So yeah, hopefully that's a helpful anecdote from experience at Segment. Yeah,
absolutely. I think incentives is probably the right keyword. Maybe what you suggest is there should be usage or revenue ceiling incentives between these two, and there are some backhand compensation when there's a good churn, handing it off to the sales team. I've started seeing that happen. I've talked to a couple of growth guys, growth PMs who are reporting into products started to get incentives associated to self-serve revenue or individual and team plans. I've talked to a couple of the companies. I can't name them on this call yet, but I've started seeing that happen. I know we'll run out of time. We have one last question for you, and this is about marketing. Let's take the case that in the pure PLG world, if you were to be a purist, the entire compensation structure for marketing might have been inbound. How to make that awareness happen, how to get the customer or the user to come to your product and sign up to your product. But what happens if there's this church and state living together, right? PLG and SLG living together. What is the role of a marketing team? Who owns outbound at that point? And when do you start the outbound and who owns it? Essentially, it's a question about when to achieve that right balance between inbound and outbound.
Yeah, on the marketing side, I'm actually a fan of having marketing's metric be pipeline generation, because that way marketing kind of owns both inbound and outbound. I don't think the AEs are like a sales team should report into marketing, but marketing's job should really be to deliver value, or like the marketing team's customers sometimes it can be considered the sales team. The way to make that incentive, going back to incentives, causing a lot of behavioral things to happen, having the right incentives and having that incentive be around pipeline certainly helps with MQLs being a vanity metric. Also, I think like having like even the SDR team or the outbound team, if you're doing outbound at scale, reporting into marketing, just ties together that like marketing's here to generate pipeline, and that pipeline is feeding the sales team, and then it's going to predictably close at a relatively predictable rate. That's the way I've seen marketing teams' incentives work bridge across like all the different PLG, SDR team, sales reps team. Is just like how can marketing align around pipeline and making that a shared metric so that all the incentives are in the right place. Happy to expand on that, but I would recommend making that a North Star metric for the marketing team.
That makes sense. Incentivizing marketing for the entire pipeline might be a generally good idea, not separate the church and state at the marketing level. Maybe we'll end it at this one. So thank you so much, Kevin. It was a pleasure to host you, and we'll have the podcast wrapped up very soon in small packages and snippets. We'll get back to you on that end.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
To all the Thrivecast listeners, if you have any suggestions on topic or any guests that you would like to recommend, please reach out to us, and thank you again for listening. Take care.